By the end of this lesson, students will be able to identify the key factors leading to the outbreak of World War I, discuss American attitudes at the outbreak of hostilities in Europe, and what incidences changed these initial attitudes. Students will also be able to name the political and military alliances that existed during World War I. Students will also be able to isolate America's contributions to the wartime effort. They will also be able to recognize the domestic characteristics of the American home front during the war, and will also be able to pinpoint America's contribution to the peace of the post-war period. Let's begin by taking a look at the origins of World War I hostilities. Since the 1870s, the competing imperialistic ambitions of the great European powers led to economic rivalries, military buildups, diplomatic maneuvering, and international tensions. In Central Europe, the expansionist Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany allied himself with the multinational Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Confronting them were Great Britain and France, who had formed an alliance with Imperial Russia. An American diplomat surmised the situation in Europe at the turn of the 20th century by stating that conflict in Europe seemed inevitable. There were just, in his estimation, too many jealousies and too much hatred. Well, these jealousies and hatred reached a boiling point when on June 28, 1914, a Serbian terrorist would assassinate the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir apparent to the Austrian-Hungarian throne in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Austria, in response, would declare war on Serbia, and Germany would declare war on Serbia as well, showing its support for Austria. This would draw Russia into the fray, who joined the conflict to defend its client state, which happened to be Serbia. Germany then declared war on Russia and France, and by August 15th, Britain declared war on Germany and Austria. Soon, Turkey and Bulgaria, along with Germany and Austria, formed the Central Powers. And on the other side, we had the Allies alliance, which included Great Britain, Russia, France, and later Japan. Now it should be noted that initially America wanted no part of what was happening in Europe. And in fact, they proclaimed to want to be out of what one British diplomat proclaimed to be the grave of nations in Europe. Then President Woodrow Wilson, who was first elected in 1912, urged that in practice as well as in theory, America should remain impartial in thought and action. But eventually, ethnic, cultural, and economic ties would come to bind most Americans to the side of the British and the French. Therefore, sympathy for the Allied cause would later translate into a call for American intervention. But these calls didn't come overnight. But America's bona fide neutrality was quickly challenged by a loophole in international law that permitted neutral nations to ship war materiel to belligerent countries. The United States chose to sell arms to the British, and some accused this action of being contrary to true neutrality. After all, when you choose to do business with one side, you are in fact choosing sides, since you now have a vested interest in who comes out on the winning side. As war waged in Europe, the threat of American involvement sparked a national debate over preparedness. Teddy Roosevelt, who was one of Wilson's predecessors in the Oval Office, and other Republicans like him, were convinced that an Allied victory was in America's best interest and therefore advocated preparedness. Preparedness was a program to expand the armed forces and to establish universal military training of American male citizens. This was actually opposed by a lot of Americans, but was embraced by members of the political class, such as Woodrow Wilson, who was facing election, or re-election rather, in 1916. Preparedness was an issue that was even supported by some American conservatives, which is remarkable when you consider that the conservatives of that era were very isolationist. Back then, an isolationist was somebody who was opposed to intervening in foreign conflicts abroad. Probably the closest thing, or the closest modern parallel we would have to that, would be somebody like Rand Paul. Preparedness wasn't an issue that was unanimously supported by all Americans, as I had previously stated. In fact, there were groups such as the American League to Limit Armaments that campaigned against such preparedness programs. But in the election of 1916, Wilson's preparedness stance helped him to strip the Republicans of a critical issue in the election of that year. Wilson's strategy, however, was a part of a two-pronged approach in which he would come to play both sides of the fence. While trumpeting preparedness on the one hand, Wilson, in a bid to try to appease his isolationist constituents, readily boasted about maintaining America's relative neutrality. His campaign slogan, after all, that year was, "He kept us out of war." The GOP nominee that year was Charles Evan Hughes, who is pictured here in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, and who Wilson would go on to narrowly defeat to recapture the White House in what was, to that point in American history, one of our closest elections ever. By the time Wilson is reelected in November of 1916, U.S. participation in World War I seemed almost inevitable. There have been many positions advanced by historians as to how and why the United States would eventually get involved when it got involved, and those reasons fell into four broad categories spanning economic, political, ideological, and strategic reasons. Some place American involvement in World War I as being economic in nature. Some say specifically and more pointedly that the bankers were involved, and those who were taking this view posit that the United States had huge economic investments with the British and the French. If the British and the French were to lose, then they would not be able to pay the United States the money that it owed them, or that they owed them. And this amounted to about $2 billion. Now, it should be noted that the United States also loaned money to Germany at a mere $27 million, I should add. But the amount of money that the British and the French owed the United States paled in comparison to that which was owed by Germany. If the British and the French could not pay back all the loans made to them by the American bankers, the United States economy could surely collapse. France and England were financing their war with those loans that the American banks were giving them. In addition, they were buying massive amounts of arms from the United States on credit. So, it could be reasonably argued that, of course, America would want to make sure that it got paid back. Germany also purchased arms, but in a much more limited fashion. So this idea that the financial interests of the American banking institutions were the reason behind our eventual involvement in World War I would later come to form the basis of so-called merchant of death theories in the 1930s, which is something that we will take a closer look at when we get to that point in class content. Others say Wilson's motives for involvement in World War I were purely political, and that media propaganda influenced America's decision eventually. They point to an incident that would occur in the spring of 1915, where a British luxury liner by the name of the Lusitania was sunk in the northern Atlantic by German submarines. Of the nearly 1,200 passengers who perished that day, nearly 10% of them were American nationals. So we see a spike in anti-German sentiment that is fueled in no small part by American newspapers who print some rather ugly things about Germany, who also run some rather derogatory cartoons featuring German leadership and German characters in them. Then there was also the matter of Mexico. Now, you may say, what does Mexico have to do with the European conflict? Well, in this case, quite a bit. In the mid-19-teens, Mexico was embroiled in a civil war, and public opinion heavily swayed against U.S. intervention in Mexico. There will be a defining moment when U.S. intervention in the Mexican Civil War would come into play when it came to our eventual entrance into World War I. That will be discussed in a little bit more detail in a future slide. Other historians believe that American entrance into the war was driven purely out of the ideological leanings of Woodrow Wilson himself. In what would later be his war address to a joint session of Congress, President Wilson stated that he wanted to make the world, quote, safe for democracy. Over time, Wilson developed a moral sense that Britain and France were fighting the good fight for freedom against a genuine evil as represented by Germany. Those who advance the ideological point of view as to why the United States would get involved in World War I say that had that sense not existed, the United States would very well have let the Lusitania incident pass, as it was nearly 2 years after she was sunk that we finally did declare war on Germany. But the proverbial straw that seemingly broke the camel's back was the so-called Zimmermann Cable. On March 1st, 1917, British intelligence shared a note with Wilson that they had intercepted what was purportedly a note authored by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann. And in this note, which was addressed to Mexican officials, Zimmermann urged Mexico to stage an attack on the United States and declare war on America. Germany promised to support Mexico in this endeavor should it decide to do so, and additionally pledged to help Mexico recapture territory that it had lost nearly a century earlier in the Mexican-American War. Zimmermann's infamous note inspired another wave of anti-German sentiment in the United States, especially in the Southwest. Adding to this was the fact that in mid-March, German subs sank no less than 4 American Freightliners.